delay here from when I say something to when you hear it. And then if you type a comment, it takes a minute for it to show up on my screen. So several other people joining. Good. Thank you. Stacy Ryan is here and Bruce Kars is here. And Bruce says, you can hear my screen and you can hear me. Thank you so much. Then, as normally I would start on camera, but since I've got the slide presentation up there, I think we'll just go ahead and get started with that. And Deborah is saying she can see the PowerPoint screen from inside Google Plus, but can't see it on the Hangout. Yeah, Deborah, you may have done what a lot of people do if they're less familiar with Hangouts. If you started your own Hangout, then you're not going to see anything in there. When you're watching someone else's Hangout, or particularly if you're joining someone else's Hangout, you have to click on the link they share with you. You don't want to click on Start a Hangout. So as long as you can see it in the Google Plus page, then you can just follow along from there, okay? All right, so let's go ahead and get started. And I'll get back on camera later and we can talk, but for now, let's go ahead with the PowerPoint demonstration. So you're all here, I assume, to learn about kinetic typography. And I am excited about sharing with you what I've been learning. So you probably saw the sample video that I shared that I called Poetry in Motion, and it was based on a poem called Trees that I remembered learning as a kid. And I created that little kinetic typography video to celebrate Arbor Day with that poem. So what I'm going to do to start today, because I don't know how much experience anybody has with text animation or animation at all in PowerPoint, some of the stuff that I used in here is kind of complicated. I will go through my entire set of slides for that video and show you how I did the different things. But I want to start with some simpler animations that relate to kinetic typography. And because I'm going to be showing you behind the scenes, I'm not going to run this as a slideshow. We'll have the list over here on the side, and I'll just click on each slide as we talk about it. Okay, so I'm going to keep watching the comments on my laptop while I have this open, but if you do have any problem, if the slides aren't advancing, they might go a little slower than what I'm saying. I'll try to be conscious of that to give it time for the slides to advance. But on this first screen here, I wanted to demonstrate some of the common entrance effects that you can use for text. And this isn't just for kinetic typography. You can use these for any kind of slide presentation. And two of the most common ways to bring text into the screen are using, let me get my animation pane up here so you can see what we're talking about. So up here we have some of the most commonly used entrance effects, and the one that is being used on this block over here is called float in, and then on this one I used fly in. So let's see what each of those looks like, and we'll talk about the difference. So the first one, can you see the difference there? The one on the left comes in more slowly, and then the one on the right moves more quickly. Plus, I broke this one up. Instead of bringing in the whole block of text in the same animation, on this side I broke it up into two parts, so I could bring one part in from the top and then the other part bring it in up from the bottom. So the basic differences between those two: for one thing, float in, like I said, moves more slowly. It doesn't start at the edge of the slide. So for instance, if we had this, if we move this whole thing down on the screen and then watch how that floats in again, you'll see it doesn't start from way up here at the top. It starts from maybe about here. Do you see that? As opposed to this one, actually starts from off the slide. Now, one other big difference between these is that the float in, if we look here at the effect options, there are only two directions. You can float down or you can float up. But with the fly in, we have a whole bunch of directions. So it's much more versatile. And this is actually the one that I use much more often, partly because of the different directions, but also because it can go more quickly. And it has kind of a snappy effect that is part of what I like to use in kinetic typography. Now, the other thing, because of breaking this one up, like I said, into two separate blocks, I was able to do two things. One is bring them in from different directions, but also make this font size much bigger so that it took up about the same space as the question underneath it. And again, that's a big component of what people normally do with kinetic typography, enlarging certain parts of the text so that it fills the same dimensions as another part in a smaller font. And one other way that you can do that, I'll show you on the next slide, is using a different effect that's called a zoom, where I did that on this one. I started with a smaller font size, and see over here, it's just showing us multiple. But if we look in the animation pane, we can see there are actually two effects applied to this. The first one is the zoom, and what that does is it starts small on the screen, fades in and expands like that. And then it leads right after that, I take it into the next effect, which is a grow and shrink. So it's already started expanding, and then from there I continued expanding it further. So together they look like this. And notice the second part is slower. I could speed that up if I wanted to, but that's how it normally comes in. If we take that grow shrink part and click on the effect options, or actually we could just do it from the timing. Excuse me. Notice that's set to go at medium, but we can change that to fast, and then it might continue at more of the same speed. Let's see how that looks. Still a little slower. We could try bumping it up to very fast. And then we get this. So you can still see, whoops, advanced. No, that's right. You can still see where it shifts from the first effect to the second one, but it's not quite as noticeable when we sped it up. All right. So are there any questions so far about just those two basic or three basic effects that we're looking at? If you do have a question, go ahead and type it in the chat. And Stacy, I'm glad you figured out how to get the sound to work. I see Gregory's joined us. Welcome, Gregory. Yeah, go ahead and type your questions in. Like I said, there is a little bit of a delay from when I say something. So when I tell you to type in your questions, it's going to take maybe 20 or 30 seconds before you hear that. So then by the time you type in your questions, it may sound like it's taking a while for me to answer. I'm going to go ahead and put a comment in there for you. Oops, I think I misspelled type, but you'll know what I meant. All right, so while I wait to see if there are any questions here, I'm going to show you one more thing. If we duplicate this slide, I'll show you another effect we can do where it starts to get really more interesting and more looking like a kinetic typography is if we now take this, after we've done those two animations already, we did the zoom and then we did the grow and shrink, then the next thing we could do would be to move it sideways. And that we're going to do by adding another animation. And we're going to use a motion path, which is probably one of the most important animations to use in kinetic typography. And pretty much the only one I ever use is the lines. There's a whole bunch of other weird stuff. Now, by default, it's moving it down, but we want to move it to the side instead. So we will go left. Notice they give you these little symbols here. Green is where it starts and red is where it ends. So we want to go left, which will take it like that. After I add the animation, you can see the little green triangle here between the L and the O. And then the red triangle here shows where it stops. And those triangles are going to be in the center of the text box. So we would like it to go a little bit further than that. What I'm going to do then is take that red triangle and drag it over farther to the side. Now, my finger's not real steady on my glide pad, so you can see it's moving up and down a little bit. We want to try and keep it as straight across as we can. And actually, the better way to do that, instead of trying to drag it perfectly straight, is to use the arrow keys. So now let's see what happens when we play this from the top. Okay, now let's add one more thing to that. After or while we're moving it to the side, let's also rotate it. So again, I'll just highlight that text box, add another animation, and this one will be a spin. Now, by default, it's going to spin it around like that, which is not what we want. So we're going to go to the effect options. First of all, we want it to go counterclockwise, but we don't want it to go all the way around. So I'm going to do just a quarter spin. Okay. And I want, well, you know what, let's leave it this way first, and then I'll show you another way that we could do it. Right now, they're just going to happen one after the other. Okay. Now, you might have noticed that part of the exclamation point got cut off at the top there. So one thing we might want to do is, instead of making this line go straight across, we'll actually bring it down at a little bit of an angle. And then the other thing I want to do is make it turn at the same time that it's going to the side. So I'll change this to start with previous. Now let's see how that looks. Yeah, maybe not quite the best. Maybe we do want it to move to the side first before it turns. So I'll put that back. It really should be after previous. Oops. This is just the preview in this panel here. So that's not exactly the way it's going to work when you run the slides, but okay, it's not bad. I would tweak that up a little bit more, but at least it gives you some idea of how those effects work. All right, let me check here if we have any questions before we start looking at the slides from my tree video. All right, I don't see any questions, so I guess that means one of two things. Either I'm being very clear in my training, or you guys can't figure out how the Hangout chat works. Or actually, there's a third possibility. Maybe I'm not looking in the right place for where you're putting the questions. Let's hope that's not the case. All right, so now that you've seen a little bit of how the simple animations work, let's take a look at this presentation and look at how the whole thing kind of flows together and how I add in some more complicated animations. So on the first page here, for the title page, I used basically two ways to bring the text in. One is called split, and that's what I used for the title here. Looks like this. Now, split has a couple of effects. You can, to me, this is backwards because this looks actually horizontal to me because it's going sideways, but they call that vertical, and horizontal would be if it's splitting from top to bottom instead of from side to side. Right now I have it set to move to join in the middle, but you can also do a split going out where it starts in the middle and goes out. So you get very different effects depending on what you choose. And just so you can compare, here's what the horizontal split looks like. I don't think that's nearly as effective. Okay. And then poetry in motion I did as a split as well. And that one starts from the middle and moves out. Then I wanted to have a split kind of effect for this as well, but I didn't want it going across the middle of where the tree is here. So I actually created this as two separate text blocks. Hopefully you can see, I know those little gray lines are kind of hard to see probably on the slides, but in celebration of is one text box, and then Arbor Day 2015 is a separate text box. So to create a similar kind of effect as the split, I used a wipe effect on each of these text boxes and then ran them at the same time. So on the Arbor Day one, it looks like this. So it starts on the left, on the right rather, and wipes across to the left. The other one in celebration starts from the left and wipes across to the right. And then you can see they both happen at the same time. So it ends up looking like this one did. Even though it's a different effect, a different animation, they end up looking similar. Okay, so those are two pretty easy effects to use, but they have more choices involved with them. And then we move on to where I start using the motion paths, to the lines, to move things around. So this one has a basic text box here. I started with the first I lined up on the tree trunk. And then you can probably see, here's the green arrow in the middle of that text box. And then when I click on it, you actually can see a kind of shadow effect of where it's going to end up when the animation is finished. And the effect I was trying to go for is to get the second eye lined up on the tree trunk when I moved the whole thing to the side. So here's what it looks like. And then it ends there. Okay? Not terribly complicated, but to do it, you have to know which effect is going to cause that and how to adjust it, because by default, it didn't land up exactly where I wanted it to be. So I had to drag it over to the side a little bit more. And the other thing is, it took me a bit of research to figure out which fonts I could use that would have a nice thick line of the font and pretty simple, but it still had the serif, excuse me, still had the serifs on the eye so that you could actually see it on top of the tree trunk. So I ended up using Verdana for that, because if I used just a sans serif eye without those little marks on the side, you wouldn't see it because it would just be hidden right on top of the tree trunk. All right, so again, this is just moving from right to left. And then here's where it gets, this is where really the work comes in to doing kinetic typography in PowerPoint. When that animation finishes, the text is in a different position than when we started, right? So then to go on to the next animation, we want it to continue from where the previous one ended, which means I had to, the way I did it, now since then I've discovered another way that might be a little easier, but what I did was I duplicated this slide, and I'll show you right now how that works so you get the basic idea. But I don't want this same animation to happen on this slide, so I remove that animation, and then I'm going to just manually move that text box over to the position where it ends up from the animation. Now, let's see how that looks if we move from this slide to the next one. Oh, actually, I have to play this in slideshow mode, otherwise it won't work. And then the next slide, it automatically changed, I think. Did I turn that off? Let me see. Yeah, I turned it off. Okay. So let me run that again, and I'll have to click to advance to the next slide. So that's the end of the first one. And then if I click to advance the slide, notice it jumped up a little bit, because I think when this one was run, I must have ended up moving the line down a little bit. So what we can do then is on the next slide, we can just, I'm going to use my arrow key to just nudge it a tiny bit, and then try running it again and see if that lines up better. And it still jumped a little bit. So I'll bring it down to Tap the arrow twice to see if we can get it closer here. So this is, if you're doing a series of animations, this is where it takes work. Okay, so that time it didn't move. So that one's lined up. Then we would go on to what's the next thing that's going to happen. Well, then there's another text block that comes in. And let me just get rid of this slide before I forget, because that's a duplication. All right, so if you have any questions about that idea of duplicating from one slide to the next, go ahead and type the questions in the chat. Let me just check quick before I move on. No, I don't see any questions. Maybe I'll just check on my other screen here. Nope. All right. Hopefully I've got us back to where you're still seeing my screen. This is the tricky part about Hangouts, is if I try and change screens. But I didn't change the sharing, so hopefully that's still okay. All right, so now from here, it's just a matter of bringing in additional text, moving things around, and that's where those motion path lines are most of what I'm going to be using. What I did next is I bring in another block of text from the right, and I timed that so that it makes it look like the new text is actually pushing the first block over. Of course, it's not really, but by timing, so there's just a slight delay before this text box moves. That way it makes it look like as this one comes in, it pushes the other one over. So again, fly in from the side and then a motion path to move this one over. Fairly simple. And then again, I would duplicate that, move the text boxes to the new position, make sure they line up so that as the slide changes, they're still in the same position without seeing a jump. And then from there, I moved this block up and moved the other one over at the same time, and again made it so the eye lined up with the tree trunk. Okay, so I know I'm going over this kind of fast, but those are all basically the same animation so far, and I want to get into showing you a few other effects that I used in here. Going on to the next screen, notice I used a diagonal movement here with that motion path to bring this up underneath the other text block. And then these three over here, I used fly in, I think from the left, if I remember right. Let's just play this whole slide and see what happens. Oh, fly in from the right. Okay. So that's pretty straightforward. I copied duplicated that slide, and you wouldn't actually have to duplicate that. It's just that when you get so many different animations going on in this, like if we go back to here, you get a lot of animations going on over here, and then I wanted to bring in more text from the bottom. It just gets to be a lot to keep track of on the slide. So I tend to duplicate slides and start over pretty frequently, just so there's a minimal amount going on each slide. It makes the editing much easier if you have to go back and change something. And then these lines at the bottom here, I think, fly up or float up from the bottom. Float up, yeah. So that looks like this. Okay. Then on the next screen, I actually brought in a different picture. And all of these tree pictures, by the way, are from Presenter Media, which is a company that I subscribe to for clip art kinds of graphics. And they also have animated PowerPoint effects and things. But these tree graphics all came from there. So now one thing I did going from the end of this slide is we have the words a tree down here. And then the next part of this poem starts with a tree again. So I started it from down here and then moved it up to the top here. So this looks like that. And then the other words come down on the right side. Okay. Now, when I first started working on this, I had this O brown like all the rest of it, and then I was using an animation effect to turn it red. And then it just was taking too long for that to happen. So I finally just went ahead and made it red to begin with, like it's the mouth, right? Okay, so let's go ahead then to this rather complicated looking animation pane here. And one thing I want to point out first is PowerPoint gives you some clues about what kinds of animations these are, because of two things. One is the little symbols in front of each line, and then the color of box that's used next to it to show the length of the animation. Those are different depending on what kind of animation it is. So the blue ones, the blue boxes, are all for motion paths. And the little symbols here show you what kind of motion path. These are all straight lines. In fact, they're all lines going down. They have a little green dot at the top and a red dot at the bottom. And then down here, there's a couple different motion types that I'll show you when we get there in a minute. The red stars are all exit effects, and the green stars are all entrance effects. So let's just play this whole slide first so you get an idea of what's happening. So they come down, and then they settle into the roots. Now you notice the text changed size in the middle. And that's what all of these exits and entrances are for. I tried using the shrink effect, and it was just too complicated to get it to the right size. So instead what I did was I used an exit effect for the larger text. And what that exit effect does, it's called shrink and turn. So let me just run one of them for you. Okay, it fades out and shrinks and turns at the same time and then disappears from the screen. And then as that was happening, I brought in the new text. In the smaller size. And I brought them all in at once. So right now there's no way I can even play one word for you because they're all timed to happen at the same time. So that's it, you can make that even look more smooth than what I did here, where if you want to replace one word with a different word, maybe a different color or a different size or a different font, if you fade out one and bring in the other right at the same time, it can look pretty seamless. I wasn't quite so worried about that on this because there's a lot happening here on this slide. and it's over before people even have time to stop and think about how smooth it is. So they all come down, they turn, disappear, and then the smaller font settles into the roots. Now, I'll tell you a secret. This is where I stopped when I first started working on this video, which was more than a year ago. I was working on it for Arbor Day of 2014. And by the time I got to this point, it was already a week past Arbor Day, and it was just taking me so long that I just put it away. And I got it out again this past spring and picked up from here and finished it. But it was very tedious. And in the year in between, I've actually learned a lot more about text animation. So it went more quickly this time. And I also used simpler animations from here on in, because this page really did me in. All right, going forward, these words, again, I had to duplicate the slide and copy these into the new position. And then this green part up here is a whole text box by itself, the whole phrase. And I wanted to use something that was going to make it look like those words were sort of sinking into the earth. But I didn't want it to be as complicated as this one was. So what I ended up using was this float in effect. And here's a special thing on here. When I click the effect options here, it really only lets me choose the direction. And I could have a choice of as one object all at once or by paragraph. This only really applies if you have multiple lines of text, like you would in a presentation with bullet points and everything, which I never do. But if I come over here and click the effect options here, it's going to give me some other choices. I have a tab here that's just for text animation. This shows the same kind of choices, except it doesn't. It has some additional ones. But again, this only applies if you've got like multiple bullet points of text. But on the first tab here, oops, I have to actually click on the text box, otherwise it's not going to show us those choices. On the first tab here, we have a line that says Animate Text, and we can choose all at once, by word, or by letter. And I chose by letter, and then I could adjust the delay between letters to show, to change how quickly it would settle down like that. So you can see how each letter is moving by itself, basically, even though I animated the whole text box. I didn't have to do each letter separately. And let me just show you what happens if we change the timing to 50% instead of 10%. Watch the difference now. So that should hopefully give you an idea of how that effect works. Now, I didn't want it to go nearly that slow, of course. So we'll change that back. Okay. And then we move on to the next part of the poem. This phrase here, I used a float in that sort of rose up. So it was like moving up towards God, towards the sky. And I think to get that curve in there, if I remember right, it doesn't show up on the animations here, but I think I used a word art curve for that. So that, again, is a float up like that. And then this next part, these next three animations here all happen together. And I used that split again so that it puts this one word leafy is in the middle. Then this group here, Arms to Pray, that uses a split. It comes in from the middle and goes out. And then this one starts again from the middle, so it moves from right to left. So here's what it looks like. And then as soon as they come in, I use a combination of movements that I showed you before, where I'm turning the text sideways using that spin animation. And I also had to move it with a motion path so that it would end up in the right position when it finished spinning. So let me show you what that looks like. You can see it as it runs, you know, that it's sort of, it's not just turning it sideways, it's actually lifting the whole thing up, so that, because what the spin would do is it would just turn it on its side right here, and then the text would be going up and down like this. But I wanted it to go at a shorter, I didn't do a quarter turn. I think I only did like 8 degrees or 10 degrees or something like that. And I wanted the bottom of it to end up close to the word that was still left here in the middle. Let's look at that, the details on that spin, and I'll show you, you can see how much it turned. So that one's going clockwise. I guess you can't see it from there. I have to show you down here. The effect options. Yeah, so the one on the right turns 40 degrees clockwise. And then the one on the left, oh no, I'm sorry, that was the one on the left that I showed you. And the one on the right goes 40 degrees counterclockwise. And then they each have a motion path associated with them as well. So let's play this whole slide from the top. Okay. And then moving on to the next slide. Fortunately, there wasn't much I had to carry over for this one other than the tree picture. So all the rest of the stuff was removed. And then here we just have a typical text animation. The phrase comes in, it turns to the side, the other words come out next to it. And then that middle part, where do we start here? This one, okay. So I used a basic PowerPoint shape inserted here to create this kind of nest shape, and then put the words on top of it. And then I used, I think that's in a brown color there. And then for the of robins up on the top, I used a gold color, like it would be the beaks of the birds in the nest. And then I couldn't use brown here because it wouldn't show up. It would have been too dark. So I had to use the lighter tan color, similar to what I used for the nest, just so it would show up against the dark trees. And on this, I used kind of a curly font that would look maybe more like a nest, you know, with little squiggly lines all over. I think in retrospect, I probably should have made this a little bit bigger. I think it's a little hard to see probably, but now that it's posted on YouTube, it's too late to change that. So let me play this slide for you, and then we'll advance it on to the next slide. And on this one, because I was going to talk about snow, what I did was I used a transition effect. I didn't have to program or calculate any of that. That's all handled by not an animation, but a transition, which happens between slides. And that's actually one of the secrets is that for a typical video or slideshow, you can use those transition effects to look like animation, and they're actually pretty easy to use. On this one, I used something called a vortex that I've never really used before because it's pretty wild, but it has kind of a snowstorm effect to it, so that's why I chose to use it there. And then going forward on this slide, you can see back on the animations here, again, you see a series of animations, and you can tell what kind they are by the symbols. So we have some entrance effects here for these 2 lines of text that come in, upon whose bosom snow has lain. And then the 2 exit effects removed that text before I went on to the next part. So let's see what that looks like just from there. And then notice as the clouds started coming in, this started to fade away because it would seem like it was too much on the screen to have all of that there. So I got rid of these lines by fading them out as the clouds started to come in. Now what I did with these, the clouds are just basic shapes in PowerPoint, and I brought those in, made slight variations so they didn't all look exactly the same. And then I made it so that it looked like the words were, sorry, my phone's ringing. So I made it look like the words were raining down out of the clouds, having a slanted entrance there. So this, from there, the clouds come in and the words start to fall out of the clouds. So it's not terribly complicated, but it just takes knowing which effects might produce that kind of an effect on the screen, and then how to line them up right and how to get the timing right. That's probably the biggest thing with these. All right, we're getting pretty close to the end here. This last screen, I just went back to, I loved this picture, and so that's part of why I wanted to get back to this one again that I used at the beginning. And then just pretty classic text animation, kinetic typography kind of animations here, bringing in the words in separate chunks and turning them and using different sizes. So let me just play that whole screen for you, and then we'll talk about it. Okay. So you can see over here, just a bunch of different text blocks. Actually, it's on 2 slides. I forgot I had split that up again just to make it easier, because all of these effects here are just for this part on the right side. And on the previous slide, all of these are the effects for this part on the left side. So it takes a lot of individual steps all linked together to make things look the way that they do on here. If you're doing, using more expensive software like After Effects or something like that, I don't know whether it's any easier on there. You can certainly do more complicated things on there, but to do it in PowerPoint, it's doable. It just means really thinking through what's going to happen and in what sequence and which effects you're going to use for it. I was thinking as I was preparing for this Hangout that really I think the biggest skill for this is what you might call spatial reasoning, right? Which my high school guidance counselor said I was good at. So he told me I should take lots of geometry classes. I did one, and that was enough. But I think I found a better use for my spatial reasoning skills than geometry. Of course, this didn't exist back then, but that's really what's involved, is thinking through what's going to happen, where is this going to move, and what effect can I use to get it to move there, and then what sequence does it have to happen, and what's the timing from one piece coming into the next. A lot of detail, that's all. It's not terribly complicated, it's just detailed and time-consuming. So, but if that depends also on how much of a perfectionist you are. So let me show you a little bit more about what I did here. The first block there, the poems, comes down and then expands. So you saw that, right? It drops down with the fly in, and then right after that goes into a grow and shrink kind of animation. And then additional text starts to come down. Well, first it turns, I turned both of those two phrases together and brought them over to the side. So it looks like it's one block of text, but it's really two. They just are both animated together. And then once those turn, then I brought in the other words next to it. And then again, duplicated the slide, copied all of those into their new position. And then the next slide shows the animation for the right side. And that right there, the bringing the God in and turning it, that was probably the most complicated part of that one, of just figuring out how big did it need to be, exactly what position did it need to end up in. So again, that section looks like this. All right. And then I just ended with, similar to what I had at the beginning, I didn't even animate anything on this last screen because it was just to leave up on YouTube at the end of the slide so that the recognition for the poem was there. And now that I'm looking at this, I realize I probably should have had a notice about the presenter media graphics. I don't know why I didn't include that. I should have. Okay. And here's one of my secrets too, is while I was working on this, I had copied the whole poem in here from where I found it on Google. So as I'd get one section done, then I would have to go and look up, okay, what's the next part, you know, and copy that text over. All right, so any questions? I do have one more thing I want to share with you while you're typing in your questions. Let me go ahead with that. So it occurred to me late last night that you might want to learn more about this once I finish the Hangout. So I thought, oh, I probably should have something to offer here if people do want to learn more. So I threw this together this morning. It's not real fancy, but here's what I will offer for you. Is 3 private training sessions like what we're doing now. On June 17th, which is a Wednesday evening, I'm going to go into more about text animation. And depending on who's there, it can be more advanced training or it can be more beginner training, depending on who's interested. I'll go into a lot more details about actually, rather than going through one I've already done, we'll start with a new one and actually create something and show the different animations that could be used for the text. And then on June 24th, I'm going to show you 2 third-party tools that I learned about after I had already started creating this one last year. I'm sorry, this year, after I was finishing it up. I found 2. One of them is free, and the other one is not free, but not expensive either, that they will make this whole kinetic typography and animation thing much easier. So I'll show you how those work and tell you where to get them. And then the final one on July 1st, again, a Wednesday evening, is I've been playing with how to combine the kinetic text effect, the text movement, with creating shape type graphics in PowerPoint. And for instance, one of the really cool things I discovered is how you can take a word or a short phrase in a big, thick font and sort of subtract the text from a rectangle or another shape. So you end up then with transparent text in the middle of the shape. And if you had a picture background behind it, it creates a really cool effect where you could animate the rectangle to come in. You'll see the text, but it's more like the text is cut out of the rectangle so that you would see the background image behind it. It's a very cool effect. So I'll show you how to create that and some other interesting things that you can do that take this text animation to a whole new level by adding the shapes to it. So if you are interested in that, they're going to be Google Hangouts on air, just like this. I would encourage you for those to definitely be on a microphone, and join live so that you can ask questions as we're going through it. It'll be much more interactive. It'll start at 8 p.m. Eastern time on all 3 days. I'll go for about an hour to an hour and a half and then answer questions as well. You can ask questions while I'm going through it, but we'll save time at the end for questions. And, one way we can do this too is, now that you've seen some of the beginning introduction to it, if you want to play with it yourself before the first training on the 17th, I'm happy to have you send me whatever you're working on, and we can use your examples for what I'm teaching, or I can address questions that you're running into. And the same thing after the first week when I go into more detail about animations. If you have questions you want me to address on the second one, we'll do that as well. I want to make this really serve your needs as much as possible. This isn't just about me and what I'm doing. It's about how can you use these effects. And you will, of course, have access to the recordings from the Hangouts. They won't be public recordings, so you will only have access to them if you pay for the training, which is going to be very reasonably priced. Only $37 for the whole three training series. I did not set up a sales page for this, so if you're interested, the only thing you have to do is send an email to me at success@presentationswithresults.com. If you would put PowerPoint training in the subject line so I'll know to watch for it, then what I will do is send you a PayPal link to pay the $37. And we'll just go from there. That's the easy way to do it without having to set up a sales page, since I just planned this all fairly last minute. Again, if you have any questions, please go ahead and type them in the chat, or you can email me later with questions as well. If you have questions about the three-part training series, then please feel free to email me or message me on Facebook. I know most of you are connected with me there. I hope that was useful, and I also hope that you're interested in learning more. I think it would be fun to teach a very small group of people about how to do this and how to apply it for your video marketing. That's really what the focus would be on, is what do you need to learn in order to make use of this yourself. You certainly don't need to do anything as complicated as my trees video. You can just add a few phrases to whatever you're putting together, and people will be impressed that you know how to make the text zoom and turn sideways. But the secret is, I think, to do that without making it look gaudy and ostentatious. just make it look like, oh, that caught my eye, but not to bombard them with a whole video full of it. That's my personal opinion, but you know, everybody's taste about how much is too much is going to vary. So no judgment there of what anybody decides to do with that. All right, I'm checking quick to see if there are any questions. Okay, now that is strange because I saw a comment from Deborah right before I refreshed my screen, and now I don't see it anymore. So maybe I am looking in the wrong place. Let me come out of here and check on the other pages and see if these comments, if I'm missing comments or questions. This is the one thing I don't like about Hangouts, is that there are several places where people can end up watching it. And then if they're putting comments or questions in those places, you have to check several different places, and it gets a little confusing. But I still am not seeing any comments. All right, so, okay, now I see Deborah's. Okay. She says, good stuff, Susan, thank you. Good, I'm glad you enjoyed it, Deborah. And I'm glad I didn't lose your comment. I think what happened is when I refreshed my screen on my laptop, it just took a minute for it to reappear again. So, all right, I don't see any other questions or comments. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up then. If you are interested in more training, please send me an email to success@presentationswithresults.com. That should still be on your screen. No, it's not, because I changed. No, it is there. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. It's been fun. I hope you enjoyed it as well, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.